Today's topic is very interesting. It's scaling GTM through moments that matter. And we're joined today by Tiffany, a dynamic growth and revenue ops leader with a track record of scaling companies from Series B through IPO. She really needs no introduction. She's led global teams at Microsoft, Amazon, Coupang, driving strategic rigor, operational excellence. You can't say enough about her. So, known for her clarity, energy, and instinctive leadership, Tiffany inspires cross-functional success and builds cultures of experimentation and impact. So, welcome, Tiffany. Great to have you here.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here, and that was a very gracious introduction. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, let's dive right into it. So, to start off, right, could you tell us about your go-to-market journey and how you came to this focus on moments that matter? What exactly
Yeah,
does that mean in your framework?
yeah. I like to say that, like so many people that end up in sales or in revenue, that it was accidental, right? We found something that paid the bills, but we also found something that we ended up loving because it felt authentic, being able to help customers solve problems with technology, right? Customers were having issues working through various operational problems, security problems, scale problems, all of these types of things. And so in my sales career, I was really, really grateful to work with customers actively through these types of problems and then see how these problems were solved very often by technology. During that process, what I noticed was that the problems that the customers really came to understand and value were very often not talked about in a traditional in the content that they would usually use for sales training or in the content that would be on our marketing information. The value wasn't communicated in a way that customers really could understand. And that's regardless of world-class marketing teams. I'm not trying to diss on marketing here, not at all. I think it's just really, we were looking at the problem differently. And so as I went through that process with being a direct salesperson, I started to really dig into the data. What does that look like? What does this mean? How do we start to measure it? How do we start to understand it? And then over the subsequent, I joke, second half of my career to date, it's really been about transformation of revenue and sales processes across, revenue operations, sales, marketing. And so it really provided this use case where we were able to go experiment and understand based on many different businesses and data types to kind of work backwards from a customer endpoint and then understand where in that customer journey we found those moments that customers really valued. And 99% of the time, it wasn't what we had been talking about. So that was something that was really transformational in how I started to look at just running my businesses.
Awesome. No, this makes so much sense. Can you give us some examples of when you're mapping the buyer journey, what are some of these moments? Like you said, the data told you something else. You guys had assumed other things. Uh, these moments that fundamentally shift the pipeline trajectory. How can teams spot them early and respond? What were your learnings from this whole exercise?
Yeah, so the answer to that is the moment that matters for your customer is specific to your business, right?
Mhm.
It is specific to your business. I've started calling it a leading indicator of retention, right? Because so often in business metrics, we're looking at the outputs, we're looking at revenue, we're looking at run rate, we're looking at all of those types of things like ARR, NRR, we can go over all of the metrics. But what I was searching for is where in all of my data, especially my product and marketing instrumentation data combined, where do I start seeing that there's an action or an activity that correlates to that future stated revenue outcome, right? And we started to understand those things by doing the most important thing, which is go talk to our customers, right?
Mhm.
And not talk to our customers in trying to pitch them or sell them anything, but talk to our customers and ask why, right?
Mhm.
Why does this matter to you? Help me understand. A specific example, I remember calling a customer of one of the e-commerce companies that I worked at, right? You can look at my bio. But I remember calling a customer, and that customer sold those plastic balls for like the play pits for kids, right? And that CEO had a thriving company. And I asked him, well, why does it matter where you send your products so that they can then be fulfilled by the e-commerce company? Why does it matter? And he's like, well, Tiffany, first, nobody's ever asked me that question. But if I don't get them in the FIFO process, first in, first out,
Yeah.
then what's happening is the plastic loses its elasticity, and then his sales go down. And and that to me was incomprehensible, because it's a plastic ball, but it made a huge difference in his business, right? And so I was able to go track that back, and we were able to hear that, and then we were able to see that systematically in our data across multiple types of customers, to be able to say, oh, this matters, right? And what an easy thing to do, to go correct an operational process that helps people sell more and be more productive and be more, have more impact for their customers. We were able, by listening, able to go really have the frame of reference to understand these moments and data that we saw, but we just didn't have any of the contextual information. So that's one example. There's other examples like Slack. I haven't worked at Slack, but it's a well-known story, right? That Slack's moment that matters is having a certain number of engagements and chats and DMs within a period of time, right? And that's very logical, but they didn't know, is it 5? Is it 500? Is it 5,000, right? They had to go see what that looked like. And Slack at that time was a pretty, they had very specific capabilities. So it wasn't as complex of a tool as it is today. But even in complex systems with supply chains, or SaaS products that are multi-threaded, that have multiple offers, enterprise platforms, like if you ask that question, you go and work backwards from a customer output, you'll find that moment that matters. And it probably isn't what you're talking about. Like in our supply chain, we weren't talking about first in, first out for durable goods, right? And so it really is that opportunity to listen and create those meaningful connections with your customers, whomever your customers are.
That is so awesome. Like, I remember Chamath from Facebook back in the day talked about growth marketing, and very similar to what you said with Slack. They discovered that if you have 7 friends on Facebook, your chances of staying on Facebook were like 10x higher, right? And they were basically just focusing on recommending friends so that you get to that 7 number, right? And so yeah, very, very similar example.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I was talking to folks in the data world, which is where we play in, right? The whole GTM and data. And for some of the providers, like the platforms, your Chrome extension usage and integration with CRMs are big drivers of DAU and MEU retention.
Yep.
Right. So no, this makes a lot of sense, Tiffany. Moving on, right? Like if you're talking about these identifying these moments, so which teams or roles should take the responsibility of making this decision and continuously hide, basically mine for these hidden signals? Like who should be responsible and how should they approach doing this?
Yeah.
Talking to customers, like you said, but like anything else they can do in terms of the data, like should they have a data engineer with them? Like how do you mine for these signals?
So there's a couple of approaches that I've taken, and I think the answer is that what really works best for your company, right? Because everybody works a little bit different. Some people have central data teams. Some have, a product or a program manager who's a SQL wizard and can go dive deep, right? So I think more important than the who is setting up an initiative that crosses sales, marketing, revenue operations, product, is really getting everybody into a room and say, hey, can we go and have a conversation with our customers to really understand in their words what they value. And this is not from a market research perspective, but this is a go talk to customers that love you and go talk to customers that hate you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Go talk to all of them and then ask open-ended questions, right? Don't ask product feature questions. Don't ask if you liked that button or you didn't like that button. Go and ask, what's on your mind? Like, as you worked with us, what's on your mind? What impact were you looking for, right? What's the real challenge for you? And then what, right? Go ask these incredibly open questions and listen, right? Because your customers are going to tell you something very, very different. I very often will have a very high skilled analyst or a data engineer or data scientist work with me on putting these things together. And I'm not looking for perfect correlation, right? I'm looking for directional, right? So I'm looking for like, are we 80% confident or 70% confident? Because that's just, getting from 80% to 99%. One, it's exponentially more difficult, but two, it really doesn't make a difference, right? So like you're really looking for directional, and then you can go test it and, talk to a couple more customers and say, hey, I heard that this was important. One of my other customers said this was important. What do you think? What's important to you? Right? And then that gives you the narrative that you need to be able to understand where in your data you see that.
Right. Beautiful. And, just a quick follow up on this, like once you identify these moments which matter or the data tells you stuff, uh, how do you then incorporate that into your marketing messaging, your GTM journeys, your product, obviously, right? Like has to respond to that and address those issues. Like, how do you get adoption and buy-in from these different groups?
Yeah, again, culture is king, right? A
Yeah.
culture of experimentation is king, and making it safe for all of the teams to be able to not only understand the data but engage with it, and then make sure that you're able to support rolling things back if it shows that it's not working, right? So one of the ways that I've found very successful is really getting metrics aligned across GTM that are universal for all teams, right? So marketing can measure, ROAS and various marketing metrics that they want appropriate for their organization. Sales can still measure funnel and funnel conversion and all of those types of things. But get a set of metrics that you can have that is the truth and a North Star, right, for your business, depending on, your inbound or outbound motion or whether you're PLG or whatnot. So, for inbound, is it ICP website visits, ICP in-generated leads, conversion rate, sales qualified leads. There's these types of things that you get this universal dashboard in front of you, and then you're able to say, okay, if this is a moment that matters, then the hypothesis would be that customers will do this, and we will see that reflected in that high-level universal dashboard. And what I personally have found, and I've said this on a couple of other calls, what I personally have found is that if you use that dashboard, and by dashboard, I mean, usually it's an Excel spreadsheet, right? I mean, let's be honest, right? Usually it's an Excel spreadsheet, and I will have like a weekly meeting where we go and all of the responsible stakeholders are in the room. And we don't talk about what's going right or what's going wrong. We talk about what's different than what we expected, because then that's the place where we can learn, right? And so like we have the dashboard in front of us. If it's all green, then we're like, okay, good, we're done. Like, do we need to change our assumptions? But otherwise, okay, peace, we're done. But if things are going outside of whatever our respective forecast or hypothesis is, then we dig in and we say good or bad, like up or down. We're like, why? Like what's different than what we expected? Because that gives us that opportunity to learn in a different way.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And are there like time periods because things will not change overnight, right? Like, so how do you like define like, hey, we should do this experiment for like a month, 2 months, quarter, 6 months? Like, how do you set that across teams?
Yeah, and if anybody's watching is a scientist, they'll probably appreciate the answer. One of my scientist friends kind of clued me into this one,
Okay.
which is don't look for proof, look for disproof, right? Look for data that you're wrong, right?
Mm.
Because so often when we run experiments, we say, oh, we expect this experiment to get us to this end. And after a certain statistically relevant period of time, if you have data that is not disproving you, right? That if your data says you're not wrong, you're probably pretty close to right? And again, we're not building a statistical model here. We're building a directional
Yeah.
model, right? We're building a directional motion. And then as your data improves, as you get more customer feedback, as your sales teams adapt a sales motion, as your marketing adapts marketing content, you'll get additional feedback. And in those weekly meetings, you should say, hey, I heard this is really not hitting the same way. Like, let's make this change. And then you look for data that disproves it, right? And disproving data, depending on the speed of your business, can happen in days or weeks. And very often, 4 weeks is really, you really don't need a whole lot more than that usually.
Interesting. That makes sense. So what you're saying is directionally, if you're getting the right indicators, the don't be stuck on like absolute targets, right? If directionally people are saying, "Hey, this is working for us," then you can fix other things to
Yeah.
expand it, right? No,
And
that makes sense.
it's a question of, is it I borrowed this from Jeff Bezos, right? When I worked at Amazon, a lot of the founding principles of the company were really great. And one of the ones that they talked about a lot was, is it a one-way door?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if it's not a one-way door, then what's the worst thing that can happen? Right. Is somebody going to take away your birthday? Like, the worst thing that happens is you have to have a little bit of humility. You say, I was wrong. If it's not a one-way door, and one-way doors are decisions that are irreversible, right?
Right.
Most decisions, if you really look at it, are reversible, even if they're uncomfortable. And that's okay in the process of doing this experimentation, because then you really dial into what matters and you really build customer trust if you make a mistake and then say, you know what, I made a mistake, I've corrected that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, that makes a ton of sense. Coming to one of or two of the topics, right, we love at Sprouts. One is the whole ICP and segmentation, right?
Yep.
Like everyone talks about how it's super important, yet you see like people love tools just winging it and they, doing these quarterly or annual exercises, having an overall broad look, right? Anyways, I have a lot of thoughts on that, but like would love to hear your thoughts on where do most of these GTM teams go wrong when mapping their ideal customer profile, and if you have any frameworks around how to fix this. It's a broad question, but like just initial, we can have a whole hour discussion on that, but would love to get your quick insights on this.
That's a question full of landmines, and that I think this is one where everybody has really strong opinions, right?
Right.
When I think about ICP, right, in my opinion, what I see often is people mix up ICP and persona, right? That's one of the things that I see frequently. And an ideal customer profile literally is the most narrow definition of what your perfect customer looks like,
Yeah.
right? So that you can identify what that actually means. A persona is part of a sales motion, like you have a persona of helping the CIO or the CTO understand something as part of a broader sale, right? Personas help you target message according to your marketing and sales channels, right? But your ICP doesn't change, right?
Yeah.
And what I see very often is people conflate those two things. And then as your business goes through different maturity levels, your ICP is going to change and grow and evolve. But you don't start with a platform ICP when you have one product and one sales motion, right? And one offer. Like if you're a startup and you have one product, one offer, you're starting with one ICP. As you add different side ancillary products, ancillary sales motions, ancillary things like that, you can go back and say, is this still true? And if it's not true, then you can refresh your ICP to be more inclusive. but of a broader group. But my biggest suggestion is people to start as narrow as you possibly can, because if you dial in your sales motion and excellently operate and execute the most narrow version of your ICP, your ability to then successfully operate sales in others is exponential.
Got it. Yeah, that's a great viewpoint.
Does that ring true? Does that feel true to you? I mean, I know you dig into this.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And like what we've seen is, like, there's some vertical products where they are like much more comfortable with saying, hey, this is our defined ICP. And then a lot of these horizontal products, like they're like the world is our oyster, right? Like GTM platforms, right? Like if Salesforce can sell to anybody, we can sell to anybody,
But
right?
Salesforce didn't sell to anybody at first.
Yes,
Salesforce was one thing when they started, and they had one persona, they had one ICP. Over the many decades of Salesforce, right? They added capabilities, they added tools, they added different, they added horizontal abilities, and they had to move into platform sales, but that's not where they started.
exactly.
Right? And I love the ambition of the expansive visions. But if you're going to get to that expansive, not expensive, although it may be that as well. But if you're going to get to that, you have to start with what's in front of you today, right?
Sure. And Tiffany, on that, right? Like one question we keep coming up, especially with growing startups, is SMB versus mid-market enterprise, right? Should we go after both, right? Should people go after like one or the other, right? Like for example, Clay has exploded. They are primarily SMB. We're trying to go enterprise. So how do you see that? Like, is it like start with SMBs and go up, right? Push upside, or like you start with enterprise. Rocks is another company which is starting with enterprise directly. Uh, there's no magic potion, but any thoughts on like any guiding principles?
Yeah. So when I advise companies, right, when I'm working with founders and advising companies on this, one of the things that I very frequently help guide on is this, right? And the question is really, it's a combination of what is your product? Like, what is the sales motion that you have found to be successful in selling your product, right? And that sales motion and the product will inform generally how you start going about targeting specific customers, right? For example, if you are building a PLG motion, I'm not excluding enterprises from participating, but PLG motions are generally going to be all about automation and the lowest possible touch. Or if you touch, if sales engages in a PLG motion and it's like a hybrid, it's in very specific and only very small purposeful places to help push people kind of over a buying process. So that's probably something where you're going to target small, medium business, right? Versus if you're building a horizontal platform with enterprise grade security and HIPAA and SOX compliance and all of those types of things, then you're going to have to get a different level of investing and self-awareness, because that's going to be a really hard SMB play, potentially. And you really have to have the fortitude to go into the enterprise space, right? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it depends on, that combination of problem, product, GTM motion, and then your ability to find a niche, a blue ocean inside of a market opportunity.
Right. And like, there's this new motion. Well, it's not new, but like something which is emerging more often now is, hey, we have a PLG, we get enough people in an enterprise using the PLG, and then we go and talk to the enterprise saying, so many users are already there, why don't you just do an enterprise deal with us?
Yeah, totally.
Right? SurveyMonkey back in the day used to be an expert at that, right? Like people would start using free surveys, and then you have, so any thoughts on that? Like that kind of takes your PLG, but takes the PLG out towards an enterprise motion.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan. So I've built PLG or product-led motions at multiple companies, including enterprise ones. And my favorite part about PLG is if you build it in a way that it empowers the users to self-serve and self-educate and integrate those moments that matter into the process, then it becomes an incredibly powerful funnel for your enterprise, right?
Right.
But that's not what you build it for, right? That becomes an ancillary benefit, not the
Yeah.
primary,
Sure.
right? And so in your data and in your systems, you have to make sure that you're clearly pulling those things out. And where you see that enterprise customer engaging in a meaningful way, you have to engage your sales teams very, very early in that process, even if it starts with the PLG inbound. And the reason why is that enterprise, if you only engage them at the end with a salesperson, you find them in that PLG and you start engaging, because you're going to have to go through all of the stuff that you always have to go through in an enterprise sales process.
Right. No, that makes sense. Again, the other thing, Tiffany, like, your LinkedIn posts often address these real-time data and blockers. At Sprouts, we're obviously focused on solving this dirty data and data silos,
Yep.
building like the first GTM engine for the community. Why do you believe like tackling these challenges are important? And like, can you give like examples? Like you said, you can geek out on this day in day out. Would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah. Well, I'll just speak to my own personal kind of revelation here, right? Um, when I was a salesperson, I had no idea how funnels were built, and I had no idea how marketing campaigns. I didn't know how to write a SQL query, right? I finally went into revenue operations, where I had to kind of give myself a crash course on SQL. Thank you for everybody who pushed me there. And once I learned how to extract the data, I realized that my questions changed, right? And I learned that how data is built can have a ton of assumptions in it that I never even thought about asking, right? And, how this is measured within a product usage, et cetera, right? There's assumptions even built into that. And so what I realized was that if I was going to do my job as a revenue GTM leader, I had to dive deep and understand where the assumptions are in a very different way. And that doesn't mean that I run every SQL query on my own. It doesn't mean I don't have big analytics teams or whatnot. But my revelation was that this data should be broad and democratized, and everybody should have clarity and understanding of what this data is, how to get it, and how to use it. Because especially with AI, right, this is going to become even more and more and more important, because we're going to get these incredible outputs. But if we don't know why, and we don't know how, and we don't know the questions to ask to question underlying assumptions, we're going to make some potentially pretty rough decisions, right? And so that's why I very often focus on data, because as we get more systems and more tools and more data, because AI is just going to increase the frequency and scale, if we don't get really clear and clean on that, we're going to have a rough road ahead.
Right. And so what criteria should folks use for prioritizing like external data providers, right? Like to support a scalable, reliable GTM strategy, right? Because internal data, you have your data, right? And then there are tools now, including us, like, who'll analyze all that data. What about external data sets? Like Clay obviously has unplugged this, like bring your own data or like get data, which is awesome, right? Like, not the easiest to use sometimes, but like definitely unlocking a huge value. What are your thoughts on how do folks evaluate external data vendors?
I go back to the most kind of basic question, at least for me, which is, what decision am I going to make from that data, right? Mm-hmm. Because especially with data, we so often kind of get into a trap where we think we need more data to make better decisions or different decisions or better targeting or things like that. And we get into this like more aggregation process where we actually don't need more. Sometimes we need more clarity. And if we need clarity and we need the data that provides us contextualization, and we only get that through external vendors, then absolutely go do it, right? And so at least that for me is my first spot. to always kind of do a gut check and make sure that if we're bringing in additional data, we're augmenting it in a way that drives decision making and is something that I always ask the so what question, right? The so what would change if we don't have this data? And if we can't live without it, then the answer is yes, right?
Yeah.
And it's not about action. It's not about activity. It's about, how are we building impact at scale? If we can't live without it, then yeah, that's something we need to go do.
Absolutely. And Tiffany, we are on time. One final question before we wrap this up. Like, so once we know that these are the vendors or like these are the data sets we need, quality is all over the map,
Yeah.
right? Like that's why you have platforms which are aggregating data from different platforms, right? Like being helpful. And so, how do you, any thoughts on like what you have seen? Like, how do you get quality out of like all these siloed, imperfect data sets?
A lot of work and a lot of effort. It's such a good question. And the answer is I think we're all trying to find that journey, right? We're all trying to define that journey. There are companies like Sprouts, right, who are working on finding high quality and building and stitching that across the entire GTM space, right? One of the things that I had always worked with my data teams on was really trying to instrument really like gold, input whatever you want, gold, bronze, silver, red, yellow, green, like instrument data standards and data quality standards and be able to signal those up front so that we are able to say this is more or less trusted data. And then continuing to audit that to make sure that the underlying assumptions of the data haven't changed. And as we get more and more information, that'll be really important for us to really integrate that standard, whatever that is, and get rid of that dirty data, saying like, okay, this red data, maybe it's interesting, maybe it's not, but if we don't know, then how do we characterize that so that inside of our tools and systems, we're not feeding dirty data with stuff that we know is great and leading to erroneous outcomes.
Right. Well, this can go on, but
Forever.
Tiffany, yes, we are at time right now. Thank you so much for all your inputs and the examples. I think there's a lot of like gems out there, and we look forward to keeping in touch.
Happy to be here. Thanks so much for everybody's time.
Thank you.